some of his students wrote this paper entitled Policies to Promote Growth and Economic Efficiency in Mexico. In this December, Gordon Hanson published this article, which the title is the one I used for my talk as well, which is Why Isn't Mexico Rich? Gordon Hanson is, as some of you might know, is a distinguished economist at the University of California in San Diego. And in that this was published in the Journal of Economic Literature. And in that same issue, there was this other paper by another distinguished American economist, Tim Kehoe at the University of Minnesota, entitled Why Have Economic Reforms in Mexico Not Generated Growth? Also, there was last year, there was this other paper by people at the Central Bank in Mexico, Competitiveness and Growth of the Mexican Economy, which was a survey of these arguments and reasons to why the Mexican economy is not growing. There was also this other book was published last year by the World Bank, entitled No Growth Without Equity, Inequality, Interest, and Competition in Mexico, edited by Santiago Levy, which is now the vice president at the Inter-American Development Bank, and Michael Walton, which is a professor at Harvard. And then I, myself, together with Fausto Hernandez, we published an article last year as well on a book entitled How Can Reforms Help Deliver Growth in Mexico? So the thing is, just this survey of papers and of books was just to give you an idea how there is a lot of interest on the issue of growth in Mexico in general. And the reason why is that, and that's why I was interested in studying this topic, is just because I think this summarizes perfectly what has happened in Mexico in the past 30 years, in the past 30 years, which is when the problem of economic growth started. So this graph shows 60 years of economic development in Mexico from 1950 to 2009. What you see here is like two periods, basically clearly differentiated periods. This is the first period that goes from 1950, which actually goes back to 1932, 1933, to 1982. So like 5 decades of rapid growth. This is income per capita in Mexico. So 5 decades of rapid income per capita growth in Mexico during all these 5 decades or 50 years of a rapid transition period in which Mexico, it was even called the Mexican miracle back in those years. So 50 years of rapid growth, and then at some point, sometime around 1981, 1982, everything changed. As you can see here, the trend that was upward sloping for the income per capita sort of started to change with ups and downs, and periods of crisis, high inflation, devaluation, financial crisis, and so on. So this was happening in 1981, 1982, and we have had already 27 or more years in that situation. So almost 3 decades, basically, of that process, which is pretty much like a period of stagnation. And that's why all these papers have been written, just trying to understand what has happened to the Mexican economy in the past 30 years, so that we have not been able to grow at the pace that we used to grow in the past. So and this graph summarizes what I just said, which is the annual average growth rate in those years. So this is the growth in per capita income per decade, the 1950s, the 1960s, the period that goes from 1970 to 1982, which is a 12-year period, which has two administrations in Mexico. So as you can see, from 1950 to 1982, growth at a rate of 3% per year in per capita terms. Which, if you think that the Mexican population grew at those years at around 3% per year as well, it's a relatively high growth in population, that means that GDP was growing at a rate of more or less 6% per year, which is not that bad. So it was a rapid growth in those years. But then the crisis came in 1982. This is the administration of President de la Madrid. This is the period of adjustment crisis. GDP actually contracted by 2% per year. And then we recovered the growth process in 1988, when the economy more or less stabilized and started to grow a little bit. 1980 to 1994, we grew less than 2% per year. This is Carlos Salinas de Gortari administration. Here, between these two administrations, NAFTA came into effect. that President Cedillo had a growth of less than around 1.6% per year in per capita terms. And this is the last the 9 or 10 years of the recent the rightist government administration in Mexico, which in average, at least till 2009, was pretty much zero in per capita terms. So you can see here, there was rapid growth, then contraction, and then recovery of growth, but that's started to diminish and is now basically zero. That's why there is so much interest in terms of income per capita growth in Mexico. Why is that Mexico is not growing at all? Now, this is performance Mexico vis-a-vis Mexico in the past. So Mexico has done very bad in recent years against Mexico as well in the past. Now, let's see how it has done compared with other countries. If you compare that with other countries, for example, these are a selected group of countries which at some point there was relatively similar to Mexico at some point in time, and so a few of them. And you see that from 1980, we're using here an index, which means that wherever they were in 1980, we fix that to 100, and then see what happened after that for every country. So they start from different levels of income per capita. But let's make that like the benchmark and see what has happened in those years, in the past 26 years or so. And here you see what happened. Mexico not just lagged behind all these countries in relative terms. So you see like a country like Korea, for example, between 1980 and 2006, moved from 100 to more than 400, which means that income per capita multiplied by 4 times in Korea during this period. Income per capita in a country like Irlanda multiplied by 3 times. That's what it means that it went from 100 to 300. So it really grew very fast in the GDP per capita in these economies. In countries like Portugal or Turkey, Turkey, I'm sorry, it almost doubled in this period of 26-year period or so. Whereas in Mexico, as you can see here, this is the stagnation that I was talking about. It's basically flat, which is precisely the point that I was mentioning before. The fact that there has been no growth in Mexico at all, or very small growth, very mediocre growth in the past 26 years. And this is true not just when we're comparing Mexico against Mexico in the past, it's also when you compare Mexico against some other economies in recent years. So, and that's why it's the interest. So those were my graphs. These are graphs from Hanson's paper, which is the one I showed you before, which show precisely the same thing. Mexico has done as bad as many other Latin American countries, by the way. It's not just a Mexican problem. It's a problem in Mexico, but it's also a problem in other Latin American economies. So within the group of Latin American economies, for example, the only country that has done really well is basically Chile in the past 3 decades, as you can see here. All the other countries like Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina have done as badly as Mexico. When we compare Mexico against Southern Asian countries, we see that, for example, against Malaysia, Indonesia, or Thailand, Mexico has done very poorly and has done as bad as the Philippines have done recently. So this is again using this is the benchmark and seeing what happened in the past 26 years or so. This is in per capita terms, this is income per capita. And compared with Eastern and Central European countries, again, Mexico is lagging behind countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Turkey as well. So that means that in general, Mexico is lagging behind all this group of countries, and it's doing as poorly as some of Latin American countries. Now, so far, what these graphs have shown is that that Mexico is lagging behind, has done very poorly compared with what it has been doing in the past, and it's doing very poorly when compared to other economies in the world. Now, but that's not the worst. I mean, if this were not enough, when we think about what's behind economic growth in an economy, economists, we used to think that the most important thing is labor productivity, or productivity in general. This graph shows the continuous line is GDP per capita. It's exactly the same I showed you before, which is this increase from 1950 to 1991, and then ups and downs after that. The dotted red line over here, this is real GDP per worker, which is a measure of productivity in Mexico. It's labor, which is called labor productivity. For a country to grow, for any country, productivity is like the most important force to sustain a growth process in any economy. So you see what happened to labor productivity in Mexico. It's interesting that follows a little bit of the same pattern than GDP. It grew very fast in the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s. It reached a peak at some point in around 1981 as well, and then it started to contract. But the worst thing, notice that GDP per capita, which is the continuous line, has already surpassed where we were in 1981. So we are slightly better off in terms of GDP per capita than we were in 1981. But when you look at labor productivity, which is the red line, you see that even in 2006, we were even below the peak that we reached in 1981, 1982. So that means that productivity has not even grown at all during this 26-year period. So we are having levels of productivity which are below the ones that we used to have in the early 1980s. So that's problematic, because that means that one of the most important sources of growth, which is productivity, is not actually working. And that partially explains what has happened with GDP per capita now. Okay. So, and this is probably the most, and to get a better idea of what is the problem in Mexico in terms of productivity. This is a graph from Heckman's paper and his students. And in this paper, this is GDP per hour of work. So how much output is produced by hour of work in different economies. And again, this is not a benchmark. This is in absolute levels. This is actually what is being produced per hour of work in these four countries. And these four countries means that in 1970, Mexico produced pretty much the same output per hour of work as Brazil, as Spain did, and as Chile did. Brazil was below here, right away. Since 1970 to here, to 2009, which is when this data ends, you see the difference. Spain, for example, has actually taken off, and Spain has been producing much more than Mexico, and much more than Chile. And Chile was doing relatively badly in the 1970s, which is when Pinochet was in power, when the coup d'etat took place in 1973, this Pinochet years and so on. And then at some point it started to take off again. And now it's well above Mexico's productivity. And Brazil, which has been doing relatively bad in the past 3 decades, has been doing slightly better off in the past few years, and has slowly approaching Mexico's productivity. I mean, it was well below Mexico in the 1970s, and now much closer to what it was in Mexico in 2009. It's still below, but it's getting very close. But the thing is, Mexico's productivity is stagnated, whereas in Chile it grew relatively fast, particularly after the mid-1980s, and in a country like Spain, it actually took off much earlier, around the 1970s, and now it's doing much better than Mexico. So that's the thing with Mexico. So Mexico is doing very badly against itself in the past, and Mexico is doing very badly when it's compared with other countries in the same period of time. So, and that of course has some impacts on levels of development in Mexico. So for example, these are the poverty rates in Mexico. The poverty rates in Mexico are right now, the latest data we have is 2008, and we have a different definition of poverty in Mexico. This is the red line, the green line over here is extreme poverty, and the red line over here is total poverty, including extreme and moderate poverty. Okay? So that means that 18% of the population is extremely poor in Mexico, which is not that far from what it was like almost 20 years ago. And this is a total population in poverty as a percentage of the total population, which is 47%, and which is again not that below from what it used to be 20 years ago. So because Mexico has not been growing, it's very hard to fight against poverty. So poverty then is highly prevalent in the Mexican population, which means that that 47% of the population is being poor, means that more than 50 million of Mexicans are poor. That's what it means. And that 18% of the population in Mexico is poor means that 20 million live in extreme poverty in Mexico. And living in extreme poverty in Mexico means, what that means, what this poverty line is supposed to measure, that poverty line is supposed to measure the level of income that a family needs to have in order to be able to buy a basket of goods with the minimum calories to achieve certain levels of nutrition. So that means that these 20 million people over here do not earn enough money as to buy even that minimum basket of goods, which provide them with a minimum level of calories intake that they should have according to this standard that was defined in Mexico by a committee, official committee. So that means that they are really poor. They are not even, that's why it's called pobreza alimentaria or food poverty. So they are not even able to buy that. So this is the situation in Mexico. Low growth, high poverty rates. We have not been able to fight against poverty in the past few years, particularly because we have not been able to grow. I mean, the most effective instrument to fight against poverty in general, and this is what you can see when you look at the data in China, for example, is that a lot of people in China is getting out of poverty because of the growth rate that the Chinese population is experiencing right now. And not the Chinese population, the Chinese economy is having. So because that process of growth is actually pulling these people out of poverty by the way of getting them jobs or higher salaries or so on, and therefore that's the way people get out of poverty. So, but in Mexico, because we haven't had this much growth in the past few years, we still have the same levels of poverty rates, or pretty much the same levels of poverty rates that we had 20 years ago, or almost 30 years ago in some cases. So, what makes things such performance? I mean, why is that? I mean, what has happened to the Mexican economy that we have this so if you see what they have, these papers that I just told you about, what they say, let me just make a brief summary of what they say. And the reason why I do that is because, as I said, it has been studied a lot. So I'm not going to add new explanations to this, why is this happening. I'm just going to survey what others have said about that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my opinion on how important those factors are and which ones are the more relevant. For example, Gordon Hanson, in this paper that I told you about before, he claims that there are basically four arguments. One is that explains why Mexico is not growing. One is poorly functioning credit markets. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of this. Second is which he calls distortions in the supply of non-traded inputs, which means basically monopolies in the provision of either public or private, like electricity, which is a public monopoly, telecommunications, which are basically private monopolies, skilled labor, which means that there is lack of provision of skilled labor in the economy. We'll talk about that later. And he also uses this claim by Santiago Levy, which is, as I told you before, is the vice president of the Inter-American Development Bank, who claims that part of the problem in the Mexican economy is that there are a lot of incentives for people to go into informality. And going into informality, according to Santiago Levy, is bad in the sense that reduces productivity, because going into informality means that instead of going to a job in the formal sector where you can be relatively productive, you go into informality, which is usually low productivity jobs. So and that reduces the aggregate level of productivity in the economy. So when you have these incentives, then you sort of incentivize low productivity economy in general. This is Santiago Levy's hypothesis. And then Gordon Hanson mentions a fourth factor, which is the China factor, which means that since China entered the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in the early 2000s, China has competed a lot with Mexico in a third market, and that third market is the U.S. market. So since Chinese products are very much similar to what Mexico used to produce, so they are competing against each other in the U.S. market. China has some competitive advantage because of the low wages and because of the low cost of transportation. And so the Chinese have displaced Mexican goods in the U.S. market. And this is the fourth element that he mentions.